In Rome during the 1st century BC, there lived a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the smartest and most cunning businessmen in history. He devised a brilliant plan to amass wealth like no one had ever done before. Crassus purchased around 500 slaves and trained them in firefighting. He also had a group of slaves specialized in architecture and construction, forming a comprehensive team to serve his plan. But how did he benefit from this team? Whenever a fire broke out in a house or palace in Rome, Crassus would arrive at the scene with his team, not to extinguish the fire immediately, as one might assume. Instead, he would stand before the flames and speak to the homeowner with words of sympathy, then offer a greedy proposition: either sell the house at a very low price or let the fire consume everything without any intervention. Faced with this harsh choice, most people were forced to sell their homes to Crassus at meager prices, fearing the total loss of their property. As soon as the sale was completed, Crassus would order his team to extinguish the fire as quickly as possible, saving the house while it was still habitable. But Crassus's plan didn't stop there. After the fire was put out, he would deploy his team of engineers and builders to repair the damaged houses, then offer them for rent to their former owners. In this way, Crassus amassed more properties throughout Rome at bargain prices and earned a steady monthly income from renting them out, which helped him build a vast fortune that made him one of the richest men of his era. Thus, Crassus did not need to wield a sword to become the richest man in Rome. All he had to do was wait for the fires to ignite. Through this story, we realize that slavery is a very ancient phenomenon in human history, and that slaves were not merely servants or laborers. They held various professions, including architecture. In ancient Rome, it wasn't limited to manual labor. Slaves worked in commerce, carpentry, administration, medicine, the arts, and even in land ownership. Most astonishingly, some slaves even bought other slaves. You might wonder, how can a slave buy another slave? The answer lies in the fact that talented slaves working in profitable jobs would pay a portion of their earnings to their masters while keeping the rest. Over time, some managed to accumulate enough money to buy their freedom and free themselves from slavery. And this was not limited to Rome alone. Throughout history, many slaves reached high positions and enjoyed lives better than those of many free people. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, there was a system known as devshirme, in which the Ottomans would take European Christian children and enroll them in special schools to educate and train them to become soldiers and state officials. These were not merely ordinary employees. Some even rose to very high positions, such as military leaders, ministers, and occasionally reached the post of Grand Vizier, the second highest position after the Sultan himself. In other words, a slave could become the second most powerful man in the state. Slavery was no luxury. However, this does not mean that the lives of slaves were easy, or that money and power could compensate for the loss of freedom and dignity. The examples mentioned represent rare cases compared to the millions of slaves who suffered humiliation and oppression unto death. In Rome itself, there were slaves who worked in the mines, and their lives were filled with suffering. They dug into rocky ground, carried heavy stones and broke them apart, sometimes even burning the stones to extract minerals. And what about their working hours? There were no limits. They worked until one of them collapsed from exhaustion or lost the ability to move. The only incentive to work was the sound of a whip on their backs. Any slave who felt tired or tried to pause even for a moment was whipped until they returned to work. As for death, it was a daily occurrence, so much so that some slaves welcomed it, considering it a relief from torment. Some, when they fell ill or were injured, did not even try to regain their health. They simply succumbed to death because they had no other choice. Slavery in the mines. This harsh reality was not confined to Rome. It extended to ancient Greece, Egypt, the Arab world, China, and Europe. Almost all civilizations used slaves in the mines, subjecting them to the most severe conditions imaginable. For instance, in 16th century Brazil, African slaves worked in the mines, and anyone who managed to survive for 7 years was considered an anomaly. Most of them died much sooner. The Portuguese would collect their bodies daily and bury them in mass graves due to the extremely high death toll. Slavery was not limited to men. Although men suffered from the grueling labor, women experienced a different kind of misery, as sexual slavery was rampant. In ancient times, a slave was considered private property, much like any commodity bought and sold. Thus, when a man purchased a beautiful maid, he used her for his own purposes, whether she consented or not, because to him she was merely an object. In some cases, beauty was not even the main criterion. Simply being a slave was enough. Even worse, it wasn't limited to women only. Some men exploited male slaves in similar ways. Slavery in China. One of the most famous examples of sexual slavery in history was the Forbidden City in China. In China, a man was allowed to marry only one woman, but he could buy as many courtesans as he desired. Naturally, there was no man richer or more powerful than the emperor, so Chinese emperors owned thousands of courtesans. For example, Emperor Kangxi had around 5,000 courtesans, while Emperor Qianlong's number reached 10,000, with some estimates suggesting he owned as many as 30,000 during his reign. All these women were confined within the Forbidden City, a closed complex of palaces exclusively designated for the emperor's courtesans. These palaces were guarded by eunuchs, as the emperor did not want any man to approach his women. Slavery in the Islamic world. Sexual slavery was not exclusive to China or Rome. It spread across many civilizations, including the Islamic world. During invasions and military campaigns, women were captured and then distributed among soldiers or sold in slave markets. Slavery was not specific to one people. What has been mentioned here is just a brief glimpse into the history of slavery, yet it shows us that slavery was not confined to a particular people or race. It was practiced by everyone throughout the ages: the Romans, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Europeans, the Chinese, and others. Now the question arises: how did this institution, which lasted for thousands of years, become unacceptable in modern times? Slavery emerged at the dawn of history and has been part of human societies for thousands of years. In the Sumerian civilization, which consisted of independent city-states, frequent conflicts and wars erupted between cities such as Lagash, Uruk, and Kish. These battles produced large numbers of captives, many of whom were enslaved by the victorious cities. Thus, the Sumerian civilization is often considered one of the earliest to institutionalize slavery. However, slavery predates even this era. Its origins trace back to the advent of agriculture around 10,000 years ago, long before the rise of major civilizations. Slavery in primitive societies. Before humans adopted agriculture, they lived as hunter-gatherer tribes. During wars, all captives were typically killed, resulting in total annihilation of the defeated group. With the discovery of agriculture, however, captives gained economic value. Enslaving them for agricultural labor became more advantageous than execution. A question arises: why did slavery not exist during the hunter-gatherer era? The answer is simple. Hunting provided insufficient food to sustain enslaved individuals. Tribes relied on sharing the meat of a single animal, and without preservation methods like refrigeration, long-term food storage was impossible. Historical sources of slavery. War captives. Throughout history, war captives remained a primary source of slaves, from Sumerian conflicts to modern times. Kidnapping. Kidnapping was another method of acquiring slaves. For example, The Ottoman Empire practiced the devshirme system, forcibly taking Christian children from Balkan regions, such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Albania, converting them to Islam and conscripting them into lifelong service. While some rose to high ranks, most became low-level officials, servants, or even castrated guards in Ottoman palaces. Escape attempts often led to execution or severe torture. Families resorted to desperate measures to protect their children, including feigning conversion to Islam, hiding them in remote areas, or mutilating them to render them unsuitable for abduction. The Ottomans were not alone. Roman pirates, for instance, raided coastal settlements to kidnap and sell people into slavery. Selling children poverty sometimes forced parents to sell their children into slavery. This practice appeared in numerous civilizations, such as China, from the Han Dynasty, 3rd century BCE, until the 20th century, with rare cases persisting today. Ancient Rome, Sumer, Egypt, and indigenous American societies, similar practices existed, driven by economic desperation. Offspring of slaves. In most civilizations, children born to enslaved mothers automatically became slaves. This hereditary nature perpetuated slavery across generations, eliminating the need for new captives or kidnappings. We have a fourth source of slavery, which may be the most abhorrent of all: the offspring of slaves. If a male slave engages in sexual relations with a female slave, the child born to them automatically becomes a slave, according to the vast majority of human civilizations. This was a significant source of slaves, exploited by many, but the tragedy deepens when a slave owner seeks to increase his number of slaves through reproduction. For example, when Britain imposed a ban on the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century, Americans struggled to find new sources of slaves. They resorted to what became known as slave breeding, selecting a tall, physically strong male slave and forcing him to have sex with a group of women to produce children who would add to the slave population. One might mistakenly assume this was merely about satisfying primal urges or escaping harsh labor on plantations, but the reality is far more horrific. The man was forced to rape women against their will, and often against his own. He was also compelled to rape young girls as young as 12 or 13 years old, who would resist, scream, cry, and try desperately to avoid the assault. His role involved violating sobbing children, and if he refused or failed to perform, he faced unimaginable torture. As for the female slaves, after being tortured, raped, and impregnated, one might naively imagine pregnancy as an opportunity to bear a child she could love and who might help her endure her tragic existence. But even this fragile hope was crushed when her child was forcibly taken from her after a few years and sold to another owner. Thus, she endured torture, rape, and the theft of her children. Human cruelty can reach depths unimaginable to any other creature. Historically, the primary sources of slaves included prisoners of war, kidnapping. It is time now to reflect on the history of slavery in the Islamic world. It is well known that nearly all children love sweets and sugary foods, and this simple fact was not lost on Arab and Muslim traders. Some merchants would gather quantities of dates from Islamic lands and take them to Africa to offer them to African children. After the children grew fond of the taste, the traders would gradually lead them farther from their villages by offering dates in increasingly remote locations. Once the children gathered, the traders would quickly kidnap and sell them as slaves. This painful reality was documented by the renowned Muslim scholar Muhammad al-Idrisi. However, to be realistic, this method was not widespread. The vast majority of enslaved black Africans were acquired through purchase from African kings and leaders themselves. The greater tragedy, occurred during the journey across the Sahara Desert, the second largest desert in the world and one of the hottest and driest places on Earth. Enslaved people were forced to traverse this vast distance with minimal food and water. One might ask, why were they not transported on camels or horses? The answer lies in the fact that a horse's value in Africa exceeded that of an enslaved person, with one horse sometimes traded for 15 to 20 enslaved individuals. This brutal journey, lasting 2 months or more, saw enormous numbers of enslaved people perish from thirst, hunger, exhaustion, or disease. Estimates suggest that 75% of enslaved people, 3 out of every 4, died along the way, including men, women and children forced to march under threats of violence. Travelers sometimes encountered clusters of human skulls near dried-up wells, remnants of enslaved caravans that had lost hope of finding water. This tragic trade, historically known as the Trans-Saharan slave trade, persisted for roughly 1,300 years. From the 7th century until the 19th century, while precise numbers are difficult to ascertain, it is estimated that around 10 million Africans were delivered to the Islamic world through this trade, meaning multiples of that number likely died en route. However, an important note: enslaved people who survived this harrowing journey and reached Islamic cities often experienced relatively improved conditions, partly due to Islamic teachings. Islam explicitly affirmed that enslaved people were human beings equal to their owners in spiritual terms, emphasizing accountability in the afterlife for all. Numerous Quranic verses and prophetic traditions urged kind treatment of enslaved people, forbidding excessive punishment or torture. Even rebellious enslaved individuals could not be killed or tortured by their owners. Instead, they had to be sold. Islam's most significant contribution in this context was its encouragement of zepin, manumission. Freeing enslaved people, considered a virtuous act that expiated sins and elevated one's spiritual status. Thanks to this principle, large numbers of enslaved people were emancipated in the Islamic world, unlike in the Americas, where manumission was rare or non-existent in certain periods. That said, this does not mean enslaved people in Islamic societies lived ideal or pain-free lives. They endured beatings and humiliation, much like enslaved people elsewhere. The key distinction is that Islam somewhat mitigated the brutality of slavery, often shielding them from extreme cruelty. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that most Muslim jurists across various schools of thought upheld slavery as a legally permissible institution, embedding it deeply within Islamic societies. When nations worldwide began abolishing slavery in the 19th and 20th centuries, Islamic majority countries were among the last to abolish the practice. In fact, 9 of the 10 nations that abolished slavery, the latest, were part of the Islamic world, underscoring the complex legal and social legacy of slavery in these regions. There is a critical truth previously unmentioned. Slaves in the Islamic world were not exclusively black, but also included white populations. During the military campaigns led by Muslims, vast numbers of diverse groups, such as Persians, Amazigh, Berbers, Europeans, Byzantines, and other light-skinned peoples, were enslaved. Enslavement was not limited to warfare, but also involved purchase. For example, Slavic peoples, from regions now known as Croatia, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Serbia, and others, were considered a preferred commodity in Islamic slave markets. In fact, the English word slave, and its equivalents in most European languages, derives from the term Slav, reflecting the widespread enslavement of Slavic populations in the 9th and 10th centuries, not only by Muslims, but also by Europeans, Byzantines, Jews, and Christians. In Islamic slave markets, the highest prices were typically paid for young white-skinned women, with one exception we will address later. Generally, enslaved women sold for higher prices than men in the Islamic world, unlike in the Americas, where male slaves were more valuable. This disparity stemmed from the differing purposes of enslavement. In the Americas, the focus was on grueling physical labor suited to men, while in Islamic cities, slavery centered on sexual exploitation and domestic work, making women the more sought-after commodity. Under prevailing Islamic jurisprudence at the time, a man had the unrestricted right to own any number of such concubines and jawari, even if he was already married to multiple wives. Many exploited this license, purchasing women from slave markets, whether captured in war, kidnapped, or sold by their families. A man could inspect a female slave's body before purchase to ensure she met his preferences. Once bought, she became a sexual tool at his disposal. He could sleep with her, sell her, free her, or even marry her in rare cases. The absence of legal limits on the number of concubines led to extreme excesses among caliphs and the wealthy. While some owned dozens, others possessed hundreds, and a few, like the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Rahman III of Cordoba, amassed thousands. To manage these vast numbers, secluded sections of palaces known as harems, harem or haremlek, were constructed, featuring hundreds of isolated rooms, corridors and gardens, such as the harem wing of the Ottoman Topkapi Palace. Maintaining these institutions required an army of servants and slaves. To ensure the security of harems, Muslims relied on eunuchs, castrated male slaves. However, Islamic law strictly prohibited castration within Islamic lands. To bypass this, traders smuggled children, aged 8 to 9, from Slavic or African populations to non-Islamic territories to perform crude, unprofessional castrations. These brutal procedures resulted in a 90% mortality rate due to pain, infections, or complications. The few survivors were transported amidst immense suffering by ship or across deserts to Islamic markets, where their scarcity drove prices to astronomical levels. At times, a eunuch's price surpassed even that of a white female slave, making eunuchs the most expensive commodity in Islamic slave trading history. This glimpse into the Islamic world's slavery system reveals horrors that defy simplification, such as the tragedy of Zanzibar, which deserves its own dedicated account. For now, we conclude here and move to another topic. Slavery in the Americas epitomized absolute cruelty, reaching its peak in the enslavement of Africans. A famous painting depicts Africans starving, exhausted, terrified, and lined up naked, the condition enslaved people were forced into before boarding European ships. European traders arrived in Africa, accompanied by specialized doctors and surgeons tasked with physically inspecting enslaved individuals before purchase. Men, women, and children were stripped naked and examined for defects or diseases. After this humiliating process, the enslaved were divided into two groups. Group 1, the sick and elderly, was left for African kings to handle, while Group 2, the healthy, was prepared for the transatlantic voyage. Before boarding the ships, traders branded the enslaved with hot irons, bearing their company logos or initials, searing marks onto their backs or shoulders to assert ownership. Once loaded, ships were packed far beyond capacity, with enslaved people, men, women, and children crammed naked into tight spaces, often forced to sleep standing up. The journey lasted 3 months, during which they endured inhuman conditions. Bodily functions. Crates were designated for waste, but overcrowding and restraints forced many to defecate and urinate on themselves. Food and water. Rotten food and contaminated water exposed them to diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and measles, killing 25% of the enslaved during the voyage. Daily executions. Each morning, Europeans tossed the dead or even the sick overboard to prevent infection. Fresh air. A few daily minutes on deck were spent jumping to revive their muscles, the only moment they saw sunlight. Physical torture was not the only nightmare. Many lost the will to live due to humiliation, committing suicide by leaping into the sea or starving themselves. Europeans even devised a tool to force-feed those refusing to eat. A metal tube was shoved into the enslaved person's mouth, denying them even the right to die. Survivors were subjected to eating seasoning. Weeks of physical and psychological torture akin to the suffering of Theon Greyjoy in Game of Thrones, to crush resistance and produce obedient slaves. Methods included whipping until bleeding, then rubbing salt into wounds to intensify pain, deprivation of food and water, hanging in chains under the sun. This process killed a third of the enslaved, while survivors, deemed the strongest, were sold at public auctions. Inspected like livestock, they were branded again with hot irons to mark their new plantation owners. Thus ended the Africans' journey from their villages to a life of slavery on American plantations, where they faced 18-hour workdays under whips, disease, and starvation. Statistics show half the Africans transported across the Atlantic died before reaching the plantations, victims of a system that reduced humans to cheap commodities. This glimpse into the hell endured by millions of innocents barely scratches the surface. The full horror defies words. In a cotton plantation in Washington, USA, a brutal system was imposed on newly arrived enslaved individuals. When a new enslaved person arrived to work in cotton harvesting, they were subjected to severe whipping, not just once but continuously throughout the entire day as they worked. Periodically, someone would come and whip them, a practice that might seem perplexing at first glance. Why punish someone without cause? Why whip them relentlessly all day? The truth, however, lay in a critically important economic rationale. By subjecting the enslaved person to constant whipping, the goal was to force them to work at maximum capacity under the grip of fear. At the end of the day, the cotton they harvested would be weighed. If, for example, the amount totaled 100 kilograms, this became their new maximum capacity, and they were expected to meet this quota daily. Falling short meant further whipping, often to the brink of death, with additional agony inflicted by rubbing salt or hot pepper into their wounds. Yet the tragedy did not end there. If an enslaved person adapted to the labor and increased their output, say to 120 kilograms, this new amount became the revised standard. Failure to meet it would again result in punishment. Thus, the system was designed to ensure suffering regardless of effort, trapping them in an unending cycle of cruelty. This story is but one example of the exploitative systems Europeans imposed to extract maximum profit from enslaved Africans, even if it required torture and murder. Enslaved Africans were treated neither as humans nor as animals, but as disposable tools, profited from until broken, then replaced. Another example lies in the sugarcane plantations of Spanish-controlled Cuba, where the enslaved were forced to labor from sunrise to sunset, granted fewer than 5 hours of sleep in overcrowded, sweltering quarters worse than prisons. The question arises: how did Africans endure such conditions? Back-breaking labor, meager rations, minimal rest, and relentless abuse. The truth is, many did not. Countless perished during their labor. On Brazilian coffee plantations, for instance, few enslaved individuals survived beyond 7 years, with most dying earlier due to the grueling work. When a plantation owner was asked about the economic loss from enslaved deaths, he replied, "There is no loss. I buy the enslaved person, knowing they'll likely die within a year. But in that year, I exploit their labor to recover my investment and turn a profit. Yet this was not purely economic. Some enslavers were outright sadists who relished torture and murder. Some poured hot wax on enslaved people until they died, burned them slowly, or even stuffed gunpowder into their bodies and detonated it for entertainment. Others buried enslaved individuals up to their necks, poured sugar on their exposed heads, and waited for insects to devour them alive. These extreme practices were not constant, but occurred sporadically under particularly depraved owners. As for how Africans were forced into slavery in the first place, this is another story entirely. We have not yet detailed how they were captured, trafficked across oceans in ships, or the institutionalized collusion that fueled this atrocity. It is a dark chapter, demanding its own reckoning. Slavery in Africa. Africa, a vast continent teeming with diverse peoples, ethnicities, tribes, nations, and languages, embodies a cultural mosaic that sometimes surpasses Europe's diversity. With over 2,000 languages spoken today, Africa's complexity is unparalleled. Alongside this diversity, traditions varied widely, some seemingly benign, such as the practice of sending children to guard cornfields from birds, while adults hunted or tended to households. However, this innocent custom became a golden opportunity for slave traders. Tribes that followed this tradition were monitored, and once the adults left, slave traders would swiftly raid the fields, abduct the children, and sell them into slavery. Parents returning at day's end would find their children gone, a brutal tactic that exemplified the ease with which Africans were enslaved. Remarkably, those perpetrating these acts were not Europeans, Americans, or Muslim traders, but Africans themselves. Slavery and human trafficking had existed in Africa for millennia, as in most ancient societies. When African leaders and tribes realized that Europeans and Muslims were willing to pay for enslaved people, they capitalized on this demand by selling their own kin. Rather than venturing into unfamiliar territories to kidnap people, a risky endeavor that could spark tribal resistance, Europeans and Arabs preferred purchasing enslaved individuals directly from Africans, a faster and safer method. Over time, as African kings and leaders grew enamored with European and Islamic luxury goods, such as pottery, carpets, fabrics, alcohol, hunting tools, and knives, they intensified their export of enslaved people to acquire these items. However, the game-changer in this trade was the introduction of European firearms. Upon witnessing the power of European guns, African leaders hatched a cunning plan. They purchased firearms from Europeans, used them to attack neighboring villages and states, enslaved the conquered populations, and then sold them to Europeans in exchange for more weapons. This cycle transformed Africa into a perpetual battleground, fueling bloody conflicts, swelling the number of enslaved individuals, and enriching complicit leaders. Some African kings even devised new methods to enslave their own people, such as expanding the list of crimes punishable by enslavement. Minor offenses, or even false accusations of conspiring against the king, became pretexts for condemning individuals to slavery. Thus, the continent descended into chaos, with African greed playing a pivotal role in facilitating its own devastation. Had these leaders not collaborated, Europeans and Muslims might have been forced to seek enslaved people elsewhere, potentially sparing Africa some of its suffering. Human trafficking, regrettably, was an ancient practice embraced by nearly all civilizations. The silver lining is that this brutal system has been abolished in most nations today, thanks to humanity's moral and legal progress. Yet these dark chapters of history remain stark reminders of greed's power to corrupt our humanity. We conclude this story with a historical turning point that reshaped humanity, the abolition of slavery. In 1646, a young Englishman named George Fox underwent a profound spiritual experience that transformed his life. While wandering the English countryside, Fox claimed to have communed with Christ, leading him to realize that God resides in every human being, and that connecting with the divine requires no intermediaries like clergy or churches, only introspection. His ideas soon spread, attracting followers later known as the Quakers. This group's beliefs were considered radical in their time. They rejected music, flags, women's adornments, weaponry, and grave markers. But what shocked society most was their absolute condemnation of slavery as an unjust system that must be eradicated. While this view seems obvious today, remember that slavery had been an entrenched institution for millennia, accepted by nearly all civilizations. Thus, the Quakers' opposition marked an unprecedented moral revolution. Yet, they were not alone. In the 18th century, English lawyer Granville Sharp emerged, dedicating his legal expertise to aiding enslaved Africans. One of his most famous cases involved an enslaved man named James Strong, who was brutally beaten by his owner, David Lyle, and left to die in the street. Strong managed to crawl to a physician named William Sharp, Granville's brother, who rescued and treated him. However, after recovering, Lyle kidnapped Strong again and imprisoned him, intending to ship him back into slavery. Desperate, Strong sent a plea to Granville Sharp, who rushed to the prison and threatened legal action if the transfer proceeded. Leveraging his connections, Sharp brought the case to court, where he won after a fierce legal battle. From then on, Sharp became a symbol of liberation in London, with the oppressed flocking to him for salvation. Among those inspired by his work was Dr. Peter Peckard, who was horrified by slavery's brutality. Later, as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, he launched an academic competition in 1785, debating the legality of enslaving humans against their will. Student Thomas Clarkson entered, devouring every available text on slavery, interviewing soldiers and sailors who had witnessed its horrors, and even uncovering documents from a deceased slave trader. His meticulously researched essay exposing the system's crimes won first prize. Yet Clarkson could not forget what he had uncovered. Despite opportunities for a comfortable life as a clergyman or esteemed academic, he abandoned it all to fight slavery. On May 22, 1787, he organized a historic meeting in London with Granville Sharp and others, founding the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This moment ignited a global movement that ultimately ended slavery in the British Empire in 1833. Thus, change began with individual convictions that coalesced into collective action, a reminder that human values can dismantle even the oldest systems of oppression. In an old London street, 9 Quakers committed to abolishing slavery, alongside lawyer Granville Sharp and student Thomas Clarkson, gathered to form a society aimed at ending the slave trade, arguably the greatest anti-slavery organization in human history. These ordinary men, with no political power or resources, dared to challenge a 10,000-year-old institution whose economic value rivaled the budgets of entire nations. To many, this seemed pure madness, but history proves that monumental achievements often require a touch of madness. With relentless energy, Clarkson mounted his horse and rode across Britain, gathering evidence. He boarded slave ships, recorded traders' confessions, persuaded sailors to testify against the trade, and even collected torture devices used on enslaved Africans as physical proof. He left no stone unturned. After compiling evidence, he delivered lectures at universities, public gatherings, and even Parliament, seizing every platform to expose slavery's horrors. Clarkson's efforts were likened to a moral steam engine by a contemporary poet, a rare force in history. His work, alongside that of his allies, ignited a wildfire of awareness. Renowned painter George Morland, created artworks depicting the trade's brutality, while sculptor Josiah Wedgwood designed a medallion inscribed with the image of an African man pleading, "Am I not a man and a brother?" A symbol that became synonymous with the global anti-slavery struggle. The most profound impact, however, came from survivors themselves. Olaudah Equiano, who endured and escaped slavery, authored a memoir of his ordeal. Thousands of copies sold, shocking society with its raw account. The movement transcended intellectuals. When Parliament initially rejected abolition, ordinary people, including women, launched boycotts of sugar and other slave-produced goods, mobilizing 300,000 participants. Public pressure peaked when William Wilberforce, a famed British parliamentarian, joined the cause. He became the movement's political face, waging legislative battles. Yet victory was hard-won. 2 decades of campaigns, petitions, and protests culminated in the Child Slave Trade Abolition Act of 1807. But this only halted the trade, not slavery itself. A second campaign followed, lasting another 30 years, until the Child in Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 finally freed approximately 800,000 men, women, and children across the British Empire from history's most brutal system of bondage. Thus, the dream of a few mad visionaries became reality, proving that collective will can shatter even the oldest chains. Even with this historic accomplishment, the battle was not over. While slavery was abolished in Britain and its colonies, it continued to thrive in French, Spanish, and African colonies, as well as across the Islamic world and most nations of the era. Thus, Britain faced a campaign far harder and grander than its predecessors, abolishing slavery globally, a near impossible mission, yet one it resolved to pursue. Before proceeding, a crucial note. I am not here to portray Britain as a utopian state devoted solely to justice. Like all empires in history, it has its atrocities and famines, enough to fill volumes. Yet, it also has achievements worthy of acknowledgement, chief among them, undoubtedly, the eradication of slavery. Some argue that Britain opposed slavery for economic self-interest, claiming free labor was more productive under industrialization and capitalism. But historical reality refutes this. According to American historian Seymour Drescher, British colonial productivity dropped by 35% after emancipation. If abolition had been economically profitable, why would Britain pressure France, Portugal, Spain, and the Ottomans to abolish it? Would a superpower deliberately enrich its rivals? More importantly, Britain did not free enslaved people for free. Enslavers refused to relinquish their legal property, forcing the government to pay piptums 20 million tiptons in compensation, equivalent to 2.2 billion today, plunging the empire into massive debt. This sum was merely part of the costs of naval campaigns to intercept slave ships, international treaties, and diplomatic wars. The cause had no economic motive whatsoever. Critics may counter, but Britain itself enslaved millions. True, as seen earlier, it committed horrors in its colonies. Yet the pivotal difference is that Britain was the only empire that chose, despite its past, to break the cycle. Just as we praise Islamic civilizations for science, Greeks for philosophy, and Romans for governance, it is fair to credit Britain here. As for how this was achieved, the answer lies in Britain's clout as a superpower. For example, with Portugal, it offered protection from Napoleon in exchange for curbing the slave trade. With Spain, it paid £400,000 in compensation to reduce human trafficking. In South America, it conditioned recognition of independence on gradual abolition. Thus, the empire that built its wealth on injustice became a driving force for liberation, a historical lesson on humanity's capacity to correct its wrongs, even belatedly. In the United States, the issue was even more blood-soaked as a colossal civil war erupted that ended with the emancipation of enslaved people. The North, led by Abraham Lincoln, fought against the South, which clung fiercely to slavery. Watch this translated video if you wish to explore the full story. Finally, Brazil remained the last nation in the Americas to hold enslaved individuals, but after immense pressure from both internal and external forces, slavery was abolished in 1888, marking the end of this institution across the entire Western world. Today, all African-descended enslaved people in the Western world have been liberated. One might assume Britain played a central role in their emancipation, but this is not entirely accurate. A century before slavery ended in Brazil, a small nation named Haiti abolished slavery without British intervention or external pressure, through a massive slave revolt unprecedented in history. This revolution eradicated French influence and declared the abolition of slavery on the island. Regarded as the most successful slave revolt in history, some historians argue it significantly altered European perceptions of Africans and even Africans' view of themselves. Other uprisings occurred throughout history, such as the Zanj rebellion in Basra or Spartacus's revolt in the Roman Empire, but all ultimately failed due to a lack of resources and organization against the well-trained armies of the enslavers. A critical question arises: when were enslaved people emancipated in the Islamic world? At a time when Britain was spearheading campaigns to abolish slavery, this shameful institution persisted more vigorously and on a larger scale in the Islamic world than ever before. Regrettably, Muslims of that era did not establish any movement to abolish slavery or the slave trade. For instance, in 1844, the English traveller and activist James Richardson visited the Moroccan city of Meknes and appealed to the governor to abolish slavery and relay this demand to the king. The governor's response was an unequivocal refusal. "It is impossible for me to oppose the institution of slavery, as it is an ancient practice sanctioned by Islamic law. Therefore, I cannot intervene in any way." He added, "If you were to approach the king with this proposal, he would have me arrested and cut out my tongue. Even if you somehow convinced the king to abolish slavery, the people would revolt against him and behead him first." Similarly, Muhammad Shah, the renowned Iranian monarch, declared, "Slavery is permissible under our religion, and I cannot consider banning it. As for the slave trade, it brings thousands of enslaved individuals into Islam each year, making it impossible to combat or even reduce its scale." This rejection was not limited to Morocco and Iran, but permeated all Islamic states without exception, as slavery was deeply entrenched in Islamic society during that period. Moreover, the majority of religious scholars across all sects agreed on its legitimacy and utility. Consequently, Britain and other European nations launched a massive campaign to abolish slavery in the Islamic world through political pressure, treaties, media, newspapers, and even colonial force at times. Gradually, many intellectuals, activists, and rulers influenced by Western thought began working to dismantle this brutal institution, such as the Lebanese journalist Faris al-Shidiak and Turkish President Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. As for religious scholars, though most initially defended slavery's legitimacy, many later promoted a reinterpretation of Islamic law, arguing, "While slavery is indeed permitted in Islam, this ruling was temporary, tied to specific necessities of that era. In our modern age, we must oppose this institution as it contradicts the spirit and core message of Islam." Through these cumulative efforts, slavery in the Islamic world ended after a struggle spanning over a century. In Mauritania, slavery was officially abolished in 1981, making it the last country in the world to dismantle this barbaric system. 200 years prior to this, Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, and Quakers gathered in Clarkson's old library to pursue a mad project that drew widespread ridicule. Yet their initiative evolved into laws, then into a major British campaign joined by other nations, activists, rulers, intellectuals, and politicians, until slavery was formally abolished worldwide. This story stands as one of humanity's most inspiring narratives, demonstrating that while humans are capable of war and atrocities, we are equally capable of compassion and collective progress. However, a crucial observation remains. The formal abolition of slavery does not equate to its eradication, as humanity remains prone to resurrecting this crime. In Europe itself, Hitler and Stalin embraced extremist ideologies and enslaved millions in the 20th century. More recently, the so-called Islamic State enslaved Yazidis and other minorities in Iraq and Syria. In Africa, while nations outlawed slavery on paper, the practice persists illegally in many regions. To this day, an estimated 7 million enslaved individuals exist in Africa, a number growing daily. Beyond Africa, per the Global Slavery Index, India alone harbors approximately 11 million enslaved people today. China 6 million, North Korea 2.5 million, and even the United States has about 1 million illegally trafficked individuals. Naturally, these figures cannot be 100% precise, as quantifying modern slavery is immensely challenging. However, most estimates suggest 30 to 50 million people remain enslaved globally. How can they be rescued? Is rescue even possible? Answers to these questions will unfold in the coming years. For now, it is time to conclude this episode.